Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show dedicated to giving you the intellectual framework to understand history, strategy, and, well, the mechanics of power.
Today, we are undertaking something of an intellectual marathon. It's a deep dive that's going to span 5 centuries of military thought.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
And our challenge really is to understand how military leaders have tried to manage and successfully envision warfare as it just grew exponentially in complexity and scale.
It is a massive scope. We're moving from, the professional but still pretty small armies of Renaissance Italy,
Right.
all the way up to the terrifying existential constraints of the nuclear age.
And just to be clear for everyone listening, we are working exclusively from a phenomenal stack of strategic thought, primarily drawn from the seminal, and I should say dense, text, Makers of Modern Strategy.
It is dense, but these sources trace the entire intellectual foundation of war.
Our mission today is not really to focus on the history of battles themselves,
No.
but more on the intellectual architecture that supports a general's mind. We want to trace the evolution of what we're calling commander's visualization.
And what do we mean by that exactly?
It's that conceptual framework a leader has to possess to anticipate, to synthesize, and then to execute these incredibly complex operations. It's so much more than just looking at a map.
It's about having the right mental model for the war you are actually fighting, not the one you wish you were fighting.
Precisely. And that mental model has had to shift, dramatically over time.
So we're going to unpack how the core assumptions of strategic mastery have changed. We'll start with the belief in the absolute primacy of a single decisive battle, then move through the emergence of mass armies, complex logistics, and finally get to the limits imposed by deterrence technology.
And our journey begins at a moment of, profound strategic crisis.
A perfect place to start.
The historical analysis in the introduction to Makers of Modern Strategy really sets the stage perfectly for us. It notes that in times of profound revolution, in technology, beliefs, social organization, all the earlier military experiences can seem entirely beside the point.
Yeah, they just don't apply anymore.
Exactly. This sense of discontinuity, this feeling that the past offered no adequate solutions, that's precisely where modern strategy begins, back in the very fragmented and volatile world of Renaissance Italy.
And the person who crystallized this feeling, who saw that the military tools of his day were fundamentally broken, was Niccolo Machiavelli.
Right.
He's often remembered as this ultimate political theorist, but our sources make a really compelling case that he became a political thinker because he was a military thinker first.
And that's a crucial distinction to make. His political conviction that Italy needed unified leadership, that it needed freedom from foreign interference, it was inseparable from his deep dissatisfaction with the military organization of the Italian states at the time.
He just saw a broken system.
A completely broken system. He believed that if Italy was to be freed from the barbarians, as he put it, someone new to power had to acquire a great reputation by discovering and implementing new rules and methods.
And when he looked around, what he saw was this endemic failure of decisiveness. It was embodied by the condottieri.
The mercenary captains.
Exactly. And the condottieri model was, it was an economic one, not a strategic one. Their goal was profit. It was self-preservation. It wasn't victory.
Which leads to a very specific kind of warfare, doesn't it?
It does. It leads to static warfare, to endless maneuver, and the active avoidance of actual decisive combat. They dominated the field with heavy cavalry, and this often led to these protracted, very costly, but ultimately
bloodless campaigns.
Machiavelli saw this as a deep institutional flaw that rendered the very concept of strategic success impossible.
So his military solution, his new rule, had to directly counteract this avoidance of risk. What was the core doctrine of decisiveness he articulated? This became the foundational vision for commanders for centuries. It was uncompromising. His central thesis was that the true aim of war is to subject the enemy to your will, full stop.
And you can't do that by just maneuvering forever.
You can't do it through skirmishes. Therefore, a military campaign must be conceived as a singular, planned operation.
Okay.
It has to be conducted under a unified command, and it must be designed explicitly to culminate in a single battle of decision.
That concept, the planned operation culminating in a decision, that's the intellectual bedrock of strategic planning, isn't it?
It is.
It demands that a commander's visualization has to be focused entirely on that one moment of physical and moral subjugation. You're visualizing the end right from the very beginning.
It mandates linearity, and it mandates purpose.
Yeah.
And to achieve this, he had to fundamentally reject the existing structure. His emphasis on recreating the powerful, disciplined Roman infantry, he details it in his Time, the art of war, was a direct political and strategic criticism of the cavalry-heavy condottieri.
He's saying the institution itself is the problem.
He believed institutional change must precede battlefield success. The commander had to visualize not just the movement of troops, but the disciplined body politic that sustained them.
This all sounds very technical, like a manual. But our sources highlight a very human element right in the middle of his work. I'm thinking of the description of the imaginary battle in Book 3 of The Art of War.
It's a remarkable piece of literature really embedded in a strategic text, and it shows the limits of systems. Machiavelli knew you couldn't just calculate everything.
Right.
So while the book covers the precise arrangement of battle lines, weaponry, camp layouts, he places this stunning piece of visualization right in the center. He describes it through the eyes of an observer watching this fictional Roman-style army engage in battle.
And it's highly emotive. The narrator asks the reader to see with what virtue our men charge. See how our general encourages his men. Behold what havoc our men wreak among the enemy.
That concept of virtue, courage, obedience, enthusiasm, ferocity, these are the intangible human qualities Machiavelli insists are absolutely necessary in war.
The irrational component.
They are the elements a commander must visualize and cultivate for success. They're fundamentally irrational and psychological, yet they are crucial to the rational execution of the plan.
So the first vision a modern commander needed wasn't just a logistical or map-based plan.
No, not at all.
It was the synthesis of the rigorous, systematic, planned operation and the unpredictable, yet necessary human energy required to execute that plan decisively.
That's a great way to put it. Machiavelli demands the commander's visualization must encompass both the rational geometry of the battlefield and the irrational moral will to win.
And that tension between the rational plan and the messy human reality, that's going to plague commanders for centuries.
Right up to the present day.
So Machiavelli gives us this philosophical blueprint for decisive planned operations. But, as you pointed out, the execution required a level of organization and scale that Renaissance states they didn't have.
They didn't. And this brings us into the military revolution spanning the 17th century. This is the period that provided the technological and, critically, the institutional tools for commanders to manage forces with real precision.
This revolution created the predictable framework that Machiavelli's ideal army lacked.
Yes. Though it was a slow process, it transformed the temporary feudal or private mercenary armies into the professional, bureaucratic state army we'd recognize today. A process that didn't really peak until the following century.
And when we talk about this revolution, I think the common assumption is that it was driven by gunpowder, muskets, cannons, better siegecraft.
Right.
But our sources, referencing Max Weber's analysis of this era, suggest something far more fundamental initiated the transformation.
It's a profoundly counterintuitive finding. Weber concluded, and I'm quoting here flatly, it was discipline and not gunpowder which initiated the transformation.
That's fascinating.
He argued that gunpowder and all the associated war techniques only became strategically significant with the existence of discipline. Before that, a musket in the hands of an undisciplined peasant was often more dangerous to his own side than to the enemy.
So discipline itself was the new military technology.
It was.
It transformed the relationship between the soldier and the state. It's no longer about temporary feudal loyalty or a mercenary contract. It's a reliable, predictable, professional force that can execute complex maneuvers.
Exactly. This shift was championed by figures like Maurice of Nassau, who systematically broke down and standardized military drill and training. Now, he didn't achieve Machiavelli's ideal of a citizen militia.
No.
But he did create a long-service mercenary force underpinned by professional officers, drill, and a standardized command structure. This standardization made a commander's operational vision vastly more realizable.
So the general could now visualize a complex movement, a wheeling turn, a volley of fire, and know the system would execute it reliably.
Which shifts the commander's focus from just managing chaos to optimizing procedure.
With the advent of these disciplined professional armies, strategy itself had to become more systemic. And this brings us to Raimondo Montecuccoli, whom the sources identify as the first modern theorist to attempt a comprehensive analysis of war in all its aspects.
Montecuccoli was the definition of the systemic strategist. Even though he didn't use our modern terminology, he didn't clearly distinguish between strategy, operations, and tactics. He provided crucial principles for battlefield visualization.
And for that decisive moment.
For the decisive moment, he emphasized two things. First, always retain a reserve. He stated that whoever at the end disposes of more intact forces wins the battle.
A foundational insight into endurance and risk management. And the second thing,
insist on immediate pursuit. The professional army had to be disciplined enough to not break formation immediately after the initial rout, but to press the advantage to annihilate the routed enemy. It's about ensuring Machiavelli's vision of decisiveness was achieved, not just a temporary retreat.
but the truly critical insight Montecuccoli provided for commanders, visualizing these large-scale operations, was putting a concrete physical limit on the sheer size they could command effectively.
That's right. He realized that army size was restricted by two physical and organizational factors. First, what one man could conveniently command, the span of control.
Right.
And second, what the logistics system could actually sustain. Now, Louis XIV was fielding massive forces, but Montecuccoli recommended an upper limit of 50,000 men for a field army.
That 50,000 number isn't just some interesting historical footnote. It's a tangible boundary for the commander's visualization.
It is. If you, the commander, visualize an operation requiring 80,000 men, Montecuccoli's analysis tells you your plan is structurally flawed. You've exceeded your capacity for logistical support and singular control.
It brings mathematics and organizational theory into the commander's mental model. It constrains ambition with operational reality. And as the 17th century progressed, the strategic focus increasingly shifted toward protracted conflict, specifically siege warfare. It was just too hard to bring these professional armies to a decisive battle in open country.
This is where we encounter the great engineer, Sébastien Le Presto de Vauban.
Vauban's contribution is often seen purely through the lens of engineering, the star-shaped fortress, the methodical siege attack. But the sources highlight that his role was profoundly strategic.
It was. Before Vauban, fortresses were often chosen for purely local importance. Guarding a bridge, controlling a single road, there was no integrated defense strategy.
He transformed these chaotic, isolated defense points into a unified national system.
He made order out of prevailing chaos. Vauban was the first to have an overall notion of the strategic role of fortresses. He systematically surveyed, selected, and strengthened forts based on a broader strategic conception, often limited by the royal economy, but always aimed at defining the strategic defense of France as a whole.
Which, in turn, forced the enemy commander to visualize the entire theater in terms of obstacles and choke points. It severely constrained their freedom of maneuver.
And his method of attack required an entirely different type of visualization from the commander compared to, say, Machiavelli's decisive shock.
So.
Vauban's system of attack was formalized, measured, almost leisurely. It was a victory by procedure. The commander was acting more like a chief engineer than a dynamic battlefield general.
Okay, so what did that look like?
The assailants would gather their men in stores safely out of range of defending fire, and then sappers would methodically dig a network of parallel trenches forward, moving step by step, inch by inch, until the breaches could be made and the assault launched.
So the visualization here shifts from the rapid, decisive shock of a field battle to a systematic, almost bureaucratic procedure focused on precision, endurance, and engineering supremacy.
It requires extreme patience, detailed management of logistics and manpower for digging, and an absolute trust in the system to deliver results over weeks or even months.
It elevates the staff officer and the sapper to a level of strategic importance, constraining the commander's mental effort into these methodical, quantifiable steps rather than bursts of inspired genius.
And that idea of refining the military instrument leads us right into the next phase.
So we have the doctrine of decisive battle, the discipline of professional armies, and these logistical and fixed systems for managing scale and defense. Moving into the 18th century, the strategic focus shifts again. Now it's centered on creating a military instrument so refined and reliable that the commander's vision could be executed perfectly.
This is the age of Frederick the Great. His genius lay in optimizing the machine that Maurice of Nassau created. Frederick focused obsessively on intensive training and drill, making his troops amenable by discipline, often through, well, brutal enforcement.
But the purpose of this incredible tactical precision wasn't just to look good on the parade ground.
Not at all. The underlying purpose, the source states, was to allow full scope to the art of generalship. The commander, Frederick, knowing his conceptions would be realized with almost robotic precision, could form his plans secure in the knowledge that his presiding intelligence would be free.
That's a pivotal moment in command visualization. It's the ultimate delegation of physical execution to a flawlessly functioning system, freeing the commander's mental energy entirely for pure intellectual command.
For strategy.
It elevates the general from a technician to an artist.
And this quest for increased efficiency and scope led directly to the next major doctrinal advance, which addressed the growing problem of scale and maneuver. And this was articulated by the Count Guibert, the strategic use of the division.
Guibert's insight was revolutionary because armies were just becoming too large and supply lines too complex to move as a single centralized mass. That was the old method. They needed speed across a wider theater without losing the integrity of the army as a single fighting force.
And what Guibert did was truly clever. He emancipated marching order from battle order. Previously, the army marched essentially in the formation it intended to fight in, which resulted in a slow, cumbersome, and very predictable ribbon of troops clogging the roads.
So before Guibert, the commander's visualization of movement was essentially static. They were already seeing the final battle line just moving slowly across the map.
Exactly. Guibert proposed that columns, the new divisions, could separate on the march. They could travel independently for speed, forage for supplies over a wider area, cover a broader theater, and even force the enemy to turn in a desired direction by presenting multiple threats at the same time.
But the crucial operational point, the thing that saved this from becoming just chaotic dispersal, is that despite separating, they concentrate rapidly for battle. They never lose the higher unity that makes them a single army.
This flexibility fundamentally changed the operational visualization for the commander. The battle was now more exactly adapted to terrain and circumstance, and significantly, it became susceptible to dynamic guidance by the commanding general after the various divisions were committed.
So the commander's mental map now has to integrate wide dispersal, rapid independent movement, and late concentration. It introduced true operational dynamism.
It did. And this new capability for speed and maneuver made the old, slow war of position so beloved by Vauban and the positional strategists obsolete.
Right. And this shift was keenly observed by Friar Heinrich Dietrich von Bülow, who provided a great business metaphor for this new supremacy of strategy.
Bülow used the concept of capital. He argued that the great art of war is to get the most out of one's capital, which meant keeping the whole army constantly in circulation.
He was advocating for strategic mobility as the engine of power.
Absolutely. And he saw the proof of this system in Napoleon's early devastating victories. He saw Napoleon's maneuver at Ulm, where the Austrian General Mack, despite having a strong army and a powerful position, was forced to surrender.
He called it
the most perfect manifestation of the superiority of strategy over tactics in modern war.
And that recognition is key. It means the commander's overall vision, their strategic conception, now transcends local tactical strengths. Through movement, positioning, and the threat of encirclement, the very principles Guibert had championed a leader could achieve victory without ever engaging in a full, decisive field battle in the old Machiavellian sense.
Strategy, through speed and maneuver, had become dominant.
Which brings us to the man who perfected it. Napoleon Bonaparte stands as the ultimate synthesizer. He took Machiavelli's doctrine of decisiveness, coupled it with Frederick's system of discipline, and injected Guibert's operational flexibility.
And it led to a profound revolution in command capability. He didn't necessarily introduce brand new technology, but he recognized the full integrated potential of changes that were already underway.
Look what?
For instance, he capitalized on the massive scale provided by conscription, which the French Revolution had normalized, giving him armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands.
And crucially, he utilized the efficient and mobile artillery reformed by Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval.
Yes. Gribeauval standardized calibers, introduced interchangeable parts, reduced the weight of the guns, and put the artillery on rapid carriages.
That technical detail is vital, isn't it?
It meant the artillery, the force that delivered the decisive physical shock, could now keep pace with the swift infantry and cavalry divisions. Napoleon's genius was bringing all these disparate components, mass manpower, Guibert's divisions, Gribeauval's mobile guns, into a highly centralized system of unexcelled destructive power.
So what was his key visualization? What was he seeing?
It was defined by speed and centralized control. He imposed firm central control on these dispersed divisions, infusing them with a revolutionary faith in rapid movement and the offensive. This mindset made possible the concentration of superior force at the decisive point.
His visualization was of a single powerful fist, rapidly assembling from dispersed fingers.
A perfect metaphor. His visualization was built on strategic triumph, aiming for the maximum political and military effect. We see this even when his initial battlefield assumptions were slightly off, like at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. The underlying strength was the sheer power of the central concept. Move quickly, concentrate overwhelming force, and exploit the resulting strategic opportunity.
The sheer mass of power he placed near the center of the Prussian state created an existential threat that no positional defense could withstand.
Exactly. But for all his brilliance, Napoleon also provides the perfect case study of the limits of centralized visualization, especially when faced with increasing army size and massive geographical theaters.
This is the breakdown of the system. He famously insisted on one-man command.
And his staff was not a general staff in the later Prussian sense. It was merely an organization for assembling information and transmitting his orders. It was designed to serve his singular presiding intelligence.
It didn't have the capacity to generate its own strategic plans.
Or any institutional decision-making power. He was the only brain in the system.
Which worked fine in the relatively compact campaigns of the early 1800s. But what happens when the scale explodes?
As armies increased in size, sometimes exceeding 400,000 troops, and operated across vast separated theaters, like the March into Russia in 1812 or the massive campaigns of 1813 in Germany, the system snapped.
The communication technology of the early 19th century was the physical constraint.
Absolutely. Orders were transmitted by courier, often taking days to reach dispersed corps commanders. The marshals, his subordinate commanders, often could not interpret his rigid central orders in accord with constantly changing local situations.
Because the situation on the ground had evolved completely since the order was dispatched.
That communication lag, that delay in feedback and adaptation, it shattered the viability of Napoleon's singular central visualization.
The technological capacity of the time, coupled with his insistence on absolute personal control, defined the physical bounds of one man's operational vision.
It's a crucial lesson. The organizational structure of command must match the scale of the conflict, or even a genius can be defeated by logistics and communication failure.
So after the sheer destruction unleashed by Napoleon across Europe, military thinkers faced this monumental task of understanding and systematizing what had just happened.
Right. And this led to the emergence of two titans of theory who, for the next century, would define how commanders visualize conflict: Antoine-Henri Jomini and Karl von Clausewitz.
The contrast between them is really the difference between operational clarity and strategic reality.
That's a great way of putting it. Jomini's influence, particularly in places like the United States, was massive and remains profoundly durable. He sought to essentially cleanse warfare theory of political context. He was aiming for pure abstract rules.
He reduced the study of war to what our sources call prescriptive techniques for military analysis and planning.
Effectively turning warfare into a huge game of chess. He emphasized simple decision-making rules, geometrical concepts like interior lines, and quantifiable operational results.
He was trying to find the unchanging, universal principles of war that would operate regardless of the specifics of terrain, culture, or political aim.
Which makes him incredibly appealing to commanders. I mean, if you can master Jomini's system, you can reduce the terrifying uncertainty of war to a set of solvable problems. You can visualize victory as a geometric puzzle solved by massing force at the decisive point.
It's the perfect, high-level, idealized flight simulator for strategy.
And I think that connection to modern systems analysis is key. The sources argue that this abstraction of war-reducing conflict to a small set of quantifiable variables like force levels, time, and space is the direct Jominian legacy that persists today.
It absolutely does. When modern strategists use model building and systems analysis in the nuclear age, they risk transforming war into an unrealistic, dangerous game by relegating all the messy factors.
Political will, culture, psychological friction.
To the background, this tendency to seek a quantifiable, solvable, abstract problem is why Jomini remains so relevant and why he draws so much criticism.
Which is precisely why Clausewitz provided the necessary and often painful corrective. His work forces the commander to integrate political reality back into their operational visualization.
And his core, famous definition is essential for every commander's mental model.
War is merely the continuation of policy by other means. This means the military objective must always be entirely subordinate to and dependent on the political purpose. Victory on the battlefield means nothing if it doesn't serve the political aim.
It's the ultimate strategic constraint. You can't visualize a military operation in a vacuum. You have to ensure that the resources, the violence, the objective, that they're all proportionate to the political goal you're trying to achieve.
And critically, Clausewitz introduced the concept that actively resists Jomini's search for clean, abstract rules. Friction, which sounds so simple but is actually the most complex part of his theory.
It is. It's the relentless cumulative effect of the many impediments to carrying out one's intentions. The danger, the mental effort, the sheer physical exhaustion, psychological factors, the weather, the fog of war.
War is never a clean, isolated, uninterrupted blow, as Jomini might visualize it. It is always a succession of violent acts interrupted by pauses for recovery and planning, dictated by exhaustion and chaos.
This means the Clausewitzian commander's visualization must accommodate and manage uncertainty, non-quantifiable human factors, and the constant failure of plans on contact with reality.
It demands a much more flexible, skeptical, and humble mindset than the Jominian calculator requires.
So that's the crux of it. Jomini offers the appealing certainty of a mathematical system.
And Clausewitz offers the sobering reality of moral, physical, and political constraint. The risk, as Hans Delbrück would later warn, is that once a strategic system is made self-sufficient and divorced from its political context, as Jomini's style encourages, the operational strategist becomes a danger to the state.
They might achieve a flawless military victory, only to precipitate a catastrophic political disaster.
The intellectual framework left by Jomini and Clausewitz was absorbed by the Prussian army as it rebuilt itself after its defeat at Jena, and this led to the institutionalization of strategy, the rise of the general staff.
And this system had to grapple with two immense new realities. Armies were exponentially larger, and technology, specifically the railway and the electric telegraph, was changing the scale and speed of war entirely.
The German general staff became the centralized, institutional memory and planning engine that Napoleon had failed to create for himself. Moltke the Elder, especially, faced a problem of scale that dwarfed Napoleon's. He had massive armies, incredible logistical complexity, and the powerful but rigid capability of the railway system.
And we have to mention the insight of economic thinkers here, like Friedrich List. He actually foresaw the strategic implications of the railway. He realized it would transform Germany, traditionally a fragmented battleground, into a coherent defensive and offensive power.
List recognized the network would transform the entire territory into one great fortress, enabling rapid mobilization and the strategic movement of massive forces along interior lines much faster than any enemy marching on foot. Moltke operationalized this.
But this new rail capability created a new problem. How do you command 300,000 men moved by train?
He had to discard the fundamental Napoleonic principle of concentrating the army well before the fight.
Why?
Because gathering that many men in one location before moving them forward would be a logistical nightmare. It would completely negate the speed advantage of the rail.
So what was his solution?
His radical and defining idea was that the concentration of the army would take place on the battlefield itself.
A paradigm shift in command visualization. Instead of seeing a massive single formation advancing, the commander visualized multiple independent columns racing toward a common point of rendezvous at the exact moment of engagement.
That required a massive leap of faith and a fundamental shift to decentralized visualization. Because while the electric telegraph was fast and provided quick, broad, strategic direction from the central general staff,
it wasn't flexible enough for real-time operational control of massive forces converging at speed.
Not even close. The operational reality meant that Moltke's system required subordinates of extremely high quality. They had to be trusted to execute tactical and operational initiative based on general initial direction.
The famous concept of Auftragstactik, or mission command, was born out of this necessity.
Exactly. The commander's visualization had to become one of synthesizing initial conditions, accepting calculated risk, and relying on the distributed intelligence and discipline of his core commanders.
And Moltke himself was acutely aware of the inherent risk in this system. He acknowledged that great successes depend not just on calculable factors, space and time, but also on
the outcome of previous minor battles, on the weather, on false news, in brief, on all that is called chance and luck. He built the system to accommodate Clausewitzian friction, not to deny it.
And yet, despite the intellectual rigor that produced Moltke's system, The tradition ultimately led to one of the most famously flawed visions in military history.
That of Alfred von Schlieffen, Moltke's successor.
Schlieffen, faced with the existential geographic danger of a two-front war against Russia and France, determinedly searched for a single, comprehensive, and early, decisive victory. He focused on one pure military plan: the extended envelopment through Belgium, the right hook.
And the fatal flaw, as critics argued, was the absolute divorce between the military mechanism and political reality. Schlieffen's writings, unlike Clausewitz's, were praised for being free from verbose theoretical speculations.
But that effort to remove friction, the political and societal context of war, was precisely what rendered the plan a menace.
His visualization was operationally brilliant, a perfect timetable of rail movement and troop deployments, but strategically myopic. It completely disregarded the immense political fallout of violating Belgium's neutrality and drawing the British Empire immediately into the conflict.
It was an operational triumph that guaranteed strategic disaster.
It was deemed the beginning of Germany's and Europe's misfortunes because it prioritized the Niederwerfung strategy, the strategy of annihilation, without pausing to consider whether the geopolitical reality allowed for anything other than an Ermittung strategy or strategy of attrition.
The visualization of the perfect military solution had supplanted the visualization of the politically viable strategy.
That brings us directly to the 20th century and the catastrophic failure of visualization that characterized the opening of the First World War.
And the sources emphasize Hans Delbrück's essential question, which became tragically relevant in 1914: annihilation versus attrition.
Delbrück's distinction is foundational to strategy. Annihilation, Niederwerfung strategy, seeks the total destruction of the enemy's military forces, regardless of cost. Attrition, Ermittung strategy, seeks to achieve the political aim by gradually exhausting the enemy's resources and will over time.
And he argued that strategy must conform to political and resource reality.
He did. And the German High Command in 1914, by staking everything on the Schlieffen Plan, the strategy of annihilation, and failing to achieve it instantly, disregarded the fundamental lesson that their relative strength meant attrition was the only viable political path. They failed to visualize a prolonged war and failed to plan for a political settlement that wasn't based on total victory.
But the immediate tactical horror, the slaughter on the Western Front, stemmed from an equally profound doctrinal blindness.
The doctrine of the offensive that completely failed to visualize the technological reality of the battlefield.
This is where the emphasis on Machiavelli's virtue came back to haunt them, wasn't it?
It did. Commanders, relying heavily on theorists like Charles Ardant Dupic and Ferdinand Foch, placed an overriding, almost spiritual importance on moral factors in war. They believed that the offensive spirit, the will to attack, and the psychological shock of the bayonet charge would overcome superior material defenses.
They had focused on certain passages from Clausewitz that emphasized psychological over material elements, forgetting Clausewitz's careful balancing of all factors.
And this led to a stunning, fatal failure of imagination. They authorized rigid, absurd attack formations, infantry advancing elbow to elbow in mass formations, in the face of devastating modern rifle, machine gun, and quick-firing artillery fire.
They literally couldn't mentally process the lethal range and sustained killing power of late 19th century small arms.
It was a massive failure of commanders to visualize the technological reality of the modern battlefield. The sources highlight that the Japanese proved at Port Arthur and Mukden that the problem of the attack could be solved, but only through intense, methodical, siege-like preparation, not reckless charges.
The European command structure had simply failed to integrate the lessons of material science and firepower into its visualization of combat,
resulting in a system that generated casualties at an unimaginable scale.
Following two world wars that refined the technology of mass destruction, we enter the post-1945 era, where the ultimate constraint on the commander's visualization is imposed: the nuclear weapon.
This is the strategic ceiling. The initial focus on massive retaliation quickly faded as the Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity. And the crucial strategic realization, articulated by thinkers like Bernard Brodie, was profound.
Which was?
In nuclear conditions, these massive arsenals tend to cancel each other out. They become tools of deterrence, not war-winning instruments, because using them guarantees mutual destruction.
That's a radical shift. The goal of strategy moves from how do I achieve victory to how do I prevent mutual suicide.
It forces the definition of conflict back toward conventional means or highly limited nuclear use. But even that limited use proved difficult to visualize safely. Strategists quickly realized the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons was incredibly difficult to sustain in practice.
So early employment of any nuclear weapon on the battlefield would likely lead to uncontrolled escalation.
Into something more horrific and less controllable.
Therefore, the ultimate constraint on the commander is the nuclear threshold. To prevent unrestricted violence, the best course of action is to visualize conflict ending, or staying, below that threshold.
The commander's goal shifts entirely from absolute victory to controlled risk and political signaling. And this brings us to Thomas Schelling, who notes that the most useful form of escalation dominance occurs at the conventional level, forcing strategy back to political coercion. Nuclear weapons become useful only through the manipulation of risk and the threat of catastrophic escalation.
Schelling called this the threat that leaves something to chance.
Yes. If deterrent threats are not credible when the threatener is in full rational control, you must relinquish some control, allow the situation to spiral a bit to achieve credibility.
Which means the modern commander must visualize conflict not in terms of achieving a military objective, but in terms of managing unavoidable risk, political coercion, and constantly calculating the distance to the critical nuclear threshold.
The strategic map is no longer geographic. It's psychological and probabilistic. And that strategic visualization is a direct descendant of Clausewitz's insistence on political control, but magnified by 1,000 orders of magnitude.
What an incredible tracing of the evolution of command strategy. We started with Machiavelli's singular vision of decisive planned battle, built through the standardization of the 17th century.
Refined by the operational flexibility of Guibbert's division concept, and then watched that centralization break down under Napoleon's sheer scale.
We then saw that essential intellectual split between Jomini's search for pure, abstract rules of war and Clausewitz's sobering insistence on political context and the reality of friction.
And finally, we saw how mass mobilization and technology delivered two massive failures of visualization. The pre-1914 focus on moral factors that ignored the machine gun, and the post-1945 realization that the sheer power of the nuclear arsenal forced the commander to prioritize survival and signaling over victory.
Successful command visualization, it seems, has always required synthesizing four elements. 1. A disciplined, reliable force. 2. Operational flexibility.
Whether it's Guibbert's division or Moltke's concentration on the battlefield.
3. A ruthless understanding of political context, the Clausewitzian dictum. And 4. An accurate assessment of technological reality, what the machine gun or the nuclear bomb actually does to the fight.
And the recurring flaw across centuries is the tendency for commanders to fall back on systems and plans designed purely for military victory, divorced from political context. The sources provide a powerful, almost unbelievable anecdote about this exact disconnect at the start of World War I.
This is the moment Moltke the Younger, head of the General Staff, was presented with a massive political opportunity. A report suggesting that Britain might stay out of the conflict if Germany refrained from attacking France through Belgium and instead focused on the east.
Moltke the Younger, rigid in his centralized thinking and bound by decades of planning, refused to change the one-war plan, even for that immense political advantage. He stated, in essence, that it was impossible because the army had only one meticulously crafted war plan that was already in motion.
And the Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm reportedly grumbled in response, "Your uncle would have given me a different answer."
It perfectly underscores the danger. When strategy becomes purely mechanistic, divorced from flexible political thought, it loses the very capacity needed to serve policy.
And in our current age, where strategic analysis relies increasingly on complex mechanistic models, systems analysis, and automated warning systems designed for efficiency and speed, we face a remarkably similar risk.
We have built systems that are brilliant at calculating optimal routes and predicting enemy maneuvers, but which are inherently divorced from human friction and political consequence.
The provocative thought left to us by these strategic histories is this. In our pursuit of efficient, high-tech warfighting systems, are we inadvertently allowing the computer model or the deeply ingrained data-driven plan to take the role of the intractable war plan of 1914?
How can modern commanders ensure their visualization remains grounded in historical understanding and crucial political reality, preventing technological determinism and efficiency metrics from dictating true strategy?
That is the deep dive you must continue.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the evolution of command strategy.